Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2017, the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's with great honor that I rise today to co-anchor this CBC Special Order Hour. I would like to acknowledge the great work and the leadership of our chair, Cedric Richmond of Louisiana, and of course my co-anchor, Mark Vesey of Texas, as we lead the discussion for the next 60 minutes. In these next 60 minutes, we have a chance to speak directly to the American people on issues of great importance to the Congressional Black Caucus, Congress, and the constituents that we represent. At this hour, we would like to discuss racism and discrimination in America, and specifically hate crimes and the radicalization and domestic terrorism that they present to the American people. The conclusion of Dylann Roof's trial a few months ago is the latest reminder that homegrown terrorism has become part of the fabric of life in America. This problem shows no sign of fading, yet reveals a threat that is both rare and more complex than simple explanation suggests. Solving the issue of domestic terrorism through hate crimes involves understanding the true nature of the problem, violent domestic extremism, so that its effective steps can be taken to protect the nation from it. It's legitimate to ask whether homegrown terrorism, and who are they being radicalized? We talk about jihadi narratives and the Islamic extremism, the Islamic State group recruiting online, but there are other groups in this nation which are radicalizing our youth, radicalizing young people to be a threat against other Americans. This is a subject and a discussion that has rarely been discussed and which we believe is very important. Since 2001, almost 40% of the nearly 150 terrorism fatalities in the United States were related to domestic motivations, not jihadi narratives. And it is my hope and the discussion that we will have this hour that we are able to discuss in depth the effect that these hate crimes and this domestic violence has on the United States. I would like to put on the record a letter that was written June 7th, 2007, by the Congressional Black Caucus to the Honorable Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, Andrew McCabe, the Acting Director of the FBI, and to John Kelly, the Secretary of Homeland Security, in which we express our concern over the alarming number of hate crimes reported across the country, particularly in the wake of the election of President Donald J. Trump. In addition to speaking out against the rising tide of hate, violence, and intolerance in this country, it is critical that those agencies, the FBI, the Department of Justice, as well as Homeland Security, speak out and proactively investigate each and every incident of potential hate crime and aggressively prosecute these cases to the fullest extent of the law. Since the election, it seems that hate-filled individuals have been emboldened by the terrorized minority to terrorize minority communities. In just the first 34 days after the election, the Southern Poverty Law Center counted a total of 1,094 bias incidents around the nation. Disturbingly, the center also calculated that 37% of these cases directly reference either President-elect Trump at the time, his campaign slogans, or infamous remarks about sexual assault. This data is just from the immediate aftermath of the election. The numbers have increased since then. It is the responsibility of this Congress, as well as those agencies, to stem this flow of violence that is occurring in this nation. We know that our president would not tolerate these sorts of matters, and we are hopeful that he, the Justice Department, the FBI, and Homeland Security will do whatever is necessary to protect American lives from hate crimes that are occurring, domestic terrorism, the radicalization of our young people to exert hate against other Americans. I would like to call my co-anchor at this time, Mark Vesey, to speak on this issue, and then we will have an opportunity to hear from other members of the Congressional Black Caucus about this. This time, I would yield as much time as he would consume to my co-anchor, Mark Vesey, of the great state of Texas.
Representative Plaskett, thank you very much for starting off this special order hour on racism and discrimination in the age of Trump. I really think that this is important and timely that we talk about this because, as you mentioned, these incidences are on the rise and we need to start to discuss them. We need to have open and honest, frank discussions about them to be quite forward, because if we don't, then we're never going to be able to move past this or be able to have a better America in regards to racism, hate, discrimination, if we don't begin just to have that open dialogue. And not only does the country need to have the open dialogue, but I think that as members of Congress, that we need to be the leaders in this area and that we should be the ones that are kicking off the dialogue and starting this. Because make no mistake about it, I know a lot of people will tell you that racism is dead, that discrimination is a thing of the past, that it was something that happened to, people that are baby boomers and older, and that, the effects of discrimination are no longer with us. But we know that that's not true. Mm-hmm. We know that, again, as you just mentioned a second ago, that since 2016, there's been a disturbing number of incidents that have occurred, a disturbing number of things that have been said, things that have been tweeted, the rise of the alt-right, so many other things that we should be very concerned about. And the Southern Poverty Law Center supports this very claim. This organization has collected over 1,300 reported bias incidents between the day after the election on February the 2nd. And let me point out, because I know that, sadly that, there are some people that will cast doubt towards the Southern Poverty Law Center, but the Southern Poverty Law Center has done a tremendous job over the last couple of decades or so of not only helping identify people that commit acts, but groups like KKK, neo-Nazi groups, and others. And quite frankly, I don't know why anyone would want to say that or try to undermine or put down an organization that wants to put down groups like that, like KKK and skinheads and Nazis. Yeah, it makes no sense. I hate when I hear people say bad things about the Southern Poverty Law Center because of the time and money and effort that they put into fighting groups, just like I just mentioned. This organization has collected over 1,300 reported bias incidents between the day after the election and February the 7th. And let me be clear, because oftentimes when we talk about race, it turns into a very divisive topic, and we don't need for this to be a divisive topic. We need to sit down, come together, and talk, because we need to create an opportunity here in America where we can change people's attitudes and make sure that our nation's history is not repeated. I also think that as parents, we have to openly talk about race, bigotry, and hate with our children. One of the things that disturbs me as a parent, and quite frankly, just as a proud American, is I'll hear people say, well, I don't say racist things at my house, so my kids would never hear that. If kids are saying racist things, then it must be because they're hearing it at home. But I got to tell you, as a parent of an 11-year-old, I know that there are influences outside of my home. I know that there's a lot of peer pressure on kids. I know there's a lot of things on social media, and kids want to fit in. Kids want to be cool, and so you can never utter one bad thing about a different nationality or race or someone of a different sexual orientation than yours in your house, and your kid could still end up being caught up in something bad like bigotry or racism just because of inappropriate influences at school. And that is why it is important, in my opinion, that as parents that we talk about this with our children, as uncomfortable as it may make us.
Right.
But we need to have the discussion. We need to know, our children need to know that it's important to us that we recognize other people's culture, that we recognize other people's faith and sexual orientation and religion. So as they're forming and they're growing, they understand that this is a nation that is a great nation that is open to everybody, regardless of race, ethnic or gender background. And I know that for some people, having to talk about racism, that it can be very uncomfortable because it makes people guilty. You know, a lot of times when it comes up or you're talking about this, you hear people trying to come up with different examples to sort of assuage any sort of guilt that they may have. You know, it makes them very, very uncomfortable. But again, we have to tackle this head on. We have to come together, confront these issues of social injustice, because it really is time that our nation heal. It's time that our nation heal, and it's time that we break the chains of our plagued history. And with that, I know that we have other members here on the House floor that want to talk, and I have some things that I'm going to mention a little bit earlier, just some of the unfortunate incidences that has happened with with the president, with the commander-in-chief, the history that he has with racism that I would, quite frankly, would like to see him address, whether it is HUD discrimination, Central Park joggers, and after they were exonerated by DNA, I think that his comments were where they still did something bad, and so on and so on. Just some of the issues at the casino that he owned in New Jersey. We need to talk about those, and quite frankly, he can be a leader. He can actually be a leader in discussing these incidents that happened under his control and under his command, whether it was at his private corporation or whether it was commenting on the Central Park joggers about how it was a learning experience for him and how he's never going to let it happen again, and how he's never going to let those words utter out of his mouth. But before I go into that, I'm going to turn it back over to the representative from the Virgin Islands, State Representative Plaskett. And again, thank you very much for kicking this off.
Thank you. Congressman Vesey, I think it's important. One of the things you talked about is what's going on in our homes and the fact that our children can be radicalized outside of the home. This is an opportunity for us as Americans to see the victimization even of those children who become a part of the alt-right, who become a part of neo-Nazi groups, that they are in fact being radicalized by these very disturbing groups, and that we as leaders in America have a responsibility. That's why, we are asking unanimous consent to have the letter that was written by Chairman Cedric Richmond put into the record, the letter of June 7th that went to the FBI, to Homeland Security, as well as to the Justice Department, to ask them to investigate and take proactive stances, not just to protect those individuals who are victimized when violence occurs, but to protect those young people and others who may be untowardly influenced by social media to become part of these groups. And I think that's a great point that you bring up, as well as our president becoming someone who can lead the charge against this. We see the rise of this activity during his campaign and after his election. Well, then our president needs to be the one to be presidential and to stem this influence and this rise of hate crimes that are taking place. At this time, we're asking that our colleague, Donald Payne from the great state of New Jersey, who has done an amazing amount of work in his own community in the area of Newark in trying to stem violence and criminal justice, the reform work that you are doing, to speak on this matter this evening. Thank you so much for the time that you are giving us.
Well, first I want to thank the gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, Congresswoman Plaskett, and the gentleman from Texas, Mark Vesey, for hosting tonight's special order hour on such an important topic, racism and discrimination. But before I begin, I want to take a moment to mark the one-year anniversary of the Pulse nightclub shooting and to remember the 49 lives that were cut short in the deadliest mass shooting in our nation's history. As we grieve for the victims and their families, we must continue to stand in solidarity with the survivors and with the LGBTQ community against hate, intolerance, for love, in support of our nation's values of equality and dignity for all. The kind of intolerance and hate and violence on display that day in Orlando has become an alarming trend in this country, a trend that has disturbingly been fueled by President Trump. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, 37% of the 1,094 bias-related incidents in just the first month after the election of the reference to president, his campaign slogans, or his remarks about sexual assault. As he did throughout his campaign, President Trump continues to speak the language of racial and cultural grievance, pitting Americans against one another and perpetuating the viciousness he pretends to despise. The result is what you would expect, a spike in hate crimes and hate speech. I've seen in my district in New Jersey where anti-Semitic graffiti was plastered on a pedestrian bridge, and we've seen it at American University, just down the road at the National Museum of the African American History and Culture, whose nooses were found last month, where nooses were found last month. Communities of color know this pain all too well. And Mr. Speaker, I am really fortunate to be able to discuss an issue of such importance to this nation. This is one nation under God, indivisible, for liberty and justice for all. You know, I have been very fortunate in my life to have been born into a situation where a great American prior to me held this seat for 23 years at the 10th Congressional District of the state of New Jersey. His name was Donald Payne. He was my father. And he afforded me a lifestyle, one of which I did not know of his suffering and pain growing up as a young African American in this country, but have, even in that situation, have found myself, irrespective of being in that position, found myself in situations that have been dangerous and uncomfortable. As a young 20-year-old, when we're 20, we do things that we probably shouldn't be doing at times. I was on my lunchtime going downtown to pay a bill at a department store where I had my first credit card. And I was running late, so what I decided to do was make a U-turn on the main street, Broad Street in Newark, New Jersey, which is the largest street in the town. And I made a U-turn to come in front of this store, and naturally, with my luck, a motorcycle police officer was coming down the street at the same time. So he pulled me over, as he should, and I was wrong. But I was using my cousin's car. And so when he asked me for my license and registration, I could not find the papers that I needed. And I was fumbling and nervous. And the officer leaned into the car and used the N-word and said, "If you don't find those documents in a minute, I'll throw you so far under the jail that they'll never find you." So this is very frightening for any citizen to go through. So I was able to get my license, and I handed it to him. So just before that, they would throw me so far under the jail that they would never find me again. Once I handed him my license, and it said that I was Donald Payne Jr., whose father was a sitting councilman in the city of Newark, his whole attitude changed. Don't you know that you could get hurt, or you could hurt someone, or you had to be careful? A minute ago, I was nothing. I would be so far under the jail they would never find me. But now that I'm connected to something or someone, all of a sudden, we've become paternal. There are millions of people that aren't connected to someone, Mr. Speaker, in this country. Millions. And these are the types of things that they go through. So I'm just here to say that we must be vigilant. I believe in this country. I believe in its greatness. I believe in the words in the Pledge of Allegiance. I believe in the Constitution. We must make it work for all Americans. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Payne, for your words, your enlightenment, and for sharing that very personal piece of you and your own experience. There are so many African Americans, so many people of color in this country who have those exact same experiences, whether it's us personally. I know I have mine exactly like that. You know, I have 4 sons that each one of them have had that kind of experience here in this country. And with the rise of hate that's occurring, we have to be careful for every American. And we need to be concerned that this country is no longer becoming a safe place for groups of individuals, that there are people that are rising up and attempting to terrorize other Americans. This should be of concern to Congress. This should be of concern to our president. And I want to thank you again, Mr. Payne, for that. At this time, we will yield time to the Congresswoman from Texas, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who sits not only on the Budget Committee, but very relevant to our discussion this evening. This sits as one of the senior members of the Judiciary Committee, as well as Homeland Security, where so many of these issues form a confluence. So thank you so much for being with us this evening, Congresswoman Jackson Lee, and we look forward to your remarks and to the enlightenment that you will be giving us here in this chamber, as well as the American people.
Well, first of all, it is my honor and privilege to thank you, Congresswoman Plaskett, for ongoing leadership in speaking to our colleagues and the American people. Let me take a moment of personal privilege to say to you that over the weekend in Texas, I was with a number of individuals from the Virgin Islands. And it certainly was my first task to tell them of the excellent representation that they were getting by you, leading on so many issues. But to you, I want to say that we were at the commissioning of the U.S. Gabrielle Giffords, and proudly so. The commander of that ship is from the Virgin Islands.
Oh, awesome.
And so there was a contingent of individuals from all over the country for recognizing the commander and his wife. And let me say that I made sure that those sailors knew who was supporting them as well, and certainly was a great honor to former Congresswoman Giffords, and it wasn't a dry eye as we did that. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you for your indulgence of that. Thank the Speaker for his indulgence. And let me also acknowledge my colleague on the floor, Congresswoman Val Demings, if I might, just to make note of the, and Floridians who are here, make note of the commemoration of the tragedy at the Pulse nightclub. This is the area in which the Congresswoman policed, if you will, and her spouse still there leads the community in law enforcement. I'll honor to those who lost their lives, but to the recognition that terrorism and hatred acts, hateful acts, are not to be accepted by any of us. And as a good friend of mine, a Muslim, said yesterday as we stood against hateful acts against Muslims around the world and in particular around the United States, he said that the way that we deal with this danger is through love and recognition of the human dignity of all. To the LGBTQ community, my deepest sympathy and recognition in this month that we honor and have Pride Month, that we recognize your deep involvement in this country and your right to human dignity. So I thank Congressman Plaskett for allowing me to engage in that statement. Let me say that I would hope that none of us would have wanted to be on the floor tonight to talk about the changing face of America since the election of the President of the United States. But in fact, to recognize that there's been a surge in discrimination throughout this nation. The roots of racial extremist violence against peaceful black communities runs deep in American history. From this country's dark past of chattel slavery to the southern lynch mobs that sought to permanently disenfranchise the black vote, to the church bombing that killed 4 little black girls in Birmingham, to the dismantling of an entire economic district in Tulsa, and to the senseless stabbing of just a few weeks ago of a bright young man by the name of Richard Collins III. I am saddened that the election of President Trump, and I'm not sure whether this has been brought to his attention, I'd like to bring it to his attention, has created a divisive atmosphere. Trump's political debut was centered on the racist birther movement, which questioned the citizenship of then President Obama. He was not in office then. And to some, it was a little humorous. Some were shocked. Certainly, the black community did not take it humorously. This was a senator who had been duly elected by the citizens of Illinois. He had done nothing to bring this commentary on himself personally. He sought the presidency of the United States. He offered to the American people all of the documentation that it would be required, and yet Donald Trump persisted for 5 years in insisting through fake news that he was not a citizen of the United States of America. During his political campaign, he repeatedly refused to reject the endorsement of white supremacist groups. He failed to condemn supporters who shouted out racist slurs and on occasion violently attacked protesters that happened to be an African-American woman in particular. In a nation completely comprised of immigrants, he has built a hateful movement around building a wall. And to my friends who are Hispanic, particularly Mexicans, he called them drug dealers and any number of names. This country has prided itself on the value of immigration, diversity, and certainly freed slaves who have come to make this country the great country that it is. Overall, his anti-immigrant incidents were the most reported, 315 incidents, followed by anti-black, 221, and anti-Muslim, 112, and anti-LGBT, 109. So I just want to take a moment to add to my commentary the things that I think are grossly horrific. That we should realize that this is not a time for the CBC to be on the floor casting blame. Let me also, as I acknowledge Congresswoman Plaskett, thank our chairperson, Congressman Cedric Richmond, for his really unceasing leadership of the Congressional Black Caucus and the work that he has done to make sure that we astutely have the information to be the conscience of the Congress. These are the pictures of hatred. This is the individual who killed the young man that I don't want to show the wrong picture, but this is a picture of an individual who was engaged in the killing of 2 individuals, I believe in Portland, Oregon, because they were trying to defend someone of a different background. We have a noose found hanging near an elementary school in Washington, D.C. This is the picture of that. This has all happened since the election of President Trump. We have an incident, June 9, 2017, the Washington Post. It says, "Shut up, slave. A spilled Starbucks drink led to a racist tirade and sidewalk fight." I don't know if people are under extreme tension, but this is all happening in 2017. We have another one, A Day Without Racism, not for Trump's administration. The Department of Justice is dismantling or lowering the Civil Rights Division, cutting the staffing that is there. Hate crimes in the U.S. rising. These are the kinds of things. And tragically, here's a young, handsome, beautiful young man who is a lieutenant who was, taking his commission and getting ready to graduate, Richard Collins III, and he was killed. Let me finish on these points about the criminal justice system that I think is very important. Black Americans are more likely to have their cars searched. Black Americans are more likely to be arrested for drug use. Black Americans are more likely to be jailed while awaiting trial. Black Americans are more likely to be offered a plea deal that includes prison time. Black Americans are more likely to serve longer sentences than white Americans for the same offense, and Black Americans are more likely to be disenfranchised. We also know that we have statistics that I'll offer into the record of Black American youth that are more likely to be included in the juvenile detention center. Police stops, police searches, use of force during arrests, juvenile arrests, transgender arrests. 60% of the transgender arrests are Black or Latino. Arrests for marijuana. Most Blacks are not likely to get pretrial release. More Blacks are likely to be prosecuted. More Blacks are likely to get prison versus community service. Length of incarceration is longer than whites. State judge incarceration, there are 208,000 people are in state prison for drug offenses. 32% are white, 68% are Black. Federal drug convictions are higher among African Americans. African Americans, 47% were Hispanics, and we are higher than those. Federal court sentencing, and of course, incarceration of women. African Americans are higher. Sentencing to life without parole, African Americans are higher, 65%. Hiring people with criminal records, that makes it very difficult for us to work, and eliminating the right to vote. So, Congresswoman, I will close by simply saying, where is the president on standing with the moral compass of asking the hatred to stop, to really empower a Department of Justice not to be led by an individual who has fought against voting rights, fought against the rights of those who are seeking to be rehabilitated in the criminal justice system, to join a bipartisan army of individuals against mass incarceration? Where is the president in standing against the hatred that has impacted the African American community, the words that he has said? Where is the president in stopping this onslaught that is generating into violence in the streets? Where is the moral compass of this administration? If it is not you, Mr. President, the Congressional Black Caucus will not take a backseat to you. We will fight and bring this country back to where it should be, and that is a country that believes in the equality of all Americans, and the African Americans who have died in blood in wars and have been slaves and, in essence, came through a reformation to be free, will not take a backseat to all of this hatred. I ask you, Mr. President, where are your answers? I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman, and thank you for your leadership on issues related to the judiciary. To others, at this time, I would like to invite the congressman, not just from New York, but from, of course, what I believe is the best, most illustrious borough in New York City, Brooklyn, of course, which is where I was born and raised. And so thank you so much, Congressman Jeffries, for your leadership on the Judiciary Committee, your discussions about the issues that we are discussing here this evening. And I'm waiting to hear what you are going to not only present to us here in this chamber, but to the American people on this issue. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished gentlelady from the Virgin Islands for yielding and for the phenomenal job that you have done, along with my classmate, the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Representative Mark Vesey. As you noted, I've got great affection for the fact that you have a significant connection to Brooklyn. We say back home there are two types of Americans, those who live in Brooklyn and those who want to live in Brooklyn. But certainly this is a significant issue that the Congressional Black Caucus has gathered here today to discuss during this hour of power, the opportunity for members of the Congressional Black Caucus to speak directly to the American people on an issue of great significance. Since January 20th, we've seen a disturbing increase here in America in anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-Black, anti-LGBT, and anti-Semitic acts. And the question is this just a coincidence? Or could it possibly have something to do with the election of the 45th President of the United States of America? Now, in part, what we're seeing is connected to a historic backlash that has often occurred throughout this journey that we've been on here in America, that whenever we make significant progress, there's always a backlash amongst some in America who've got a problem with the fact that we've done things designed to be more consistent with our values of liberty and justice for all, equal protection under the law. We know slavery was the original sin here in America. That was corrected in the aftermath of the North's victory during the Civil War. We had the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. 15th Amendment, the right to vote regardless of race. That was progress in America, followed by the inevitable backlash. The imposition of Jim Crow laws, a lynching epidemic, black codes, segregation, particularly throughout the Deep South. Progress followed by backlash. And then finally, in the 1960s, an effort to create a more perfect union and address the unfinished business in America, you had the Civil Rights Movement, anchored with the 64 Civil Rights Act, effectively ended Jim Crow. The 65 Voting Rights Act, giving African Americans in the Deep South, people of color throughout the country, the right to vote, unimpeded from things like grandfather clauses and poll taxes and other types of shenanigans that people were practicing. 1968 Fair Housing Act capped off the civil rights movement, followed by the inevitable backlash. Richard Nixon ran a racist campaign, a Southern strategy designed to appeal to aggrieved whites in parts of this country, particularly in the Deep South, ushered in an era of resistance to the progress that had been made, anti-busing, anti-affirmative action. And then, of course, we've got Barack Obama, who was elected in what many of us viewed as an incredible step in the right direction. African Americans having gone from the outhouse to the White House. 8 years of tremendous progress in moving this country forward, followed by the election of Donald Trump, a man who spent 5 years perpetrating the racist lie that Barack Obama was not born in the United States of America. And many of us are wondering, why were so many people who worship at the altar of white supremacy drawn to Donald Trump's campaign? What was it about this individual that so many folks dripping in hatred flocked to his candidacy? That's not to say that every American who voted for Donald Trump is a racist. We do know that every racist in America voted for Donald Trump. That's a problem. And so again, I just asked the question in closing, is this all a big coincidence? We know part of it is the backlash that has often occurred whenever we've made progress in America. But this president has a responsibility to address the rise in hate crimes that have taken place on his watch, whether or not his election is directly connected to it. Many of us have our own suspicions, but he's the commander-in-chief. And he's got to tell his attorney general, who is straight out of central casting in terms of the good old boys, he's got to tell his attorney general that your job as chief law enforcement officer in the land is to enforce the laws, whether you like them or not.
Refrain from engaging in personalities towards the president. The gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands may continue.
At this time, I would yield additional time to Congresswoman Hakeem Jeffries. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. And in closing, I'll simply say that every single thing that has been said, and I would urge you to challenge anything, is a fact. And in fact, there are facts that have been left out in terms of my remarks about the 45th President of the United States. I've actually been kind of gentle as it relates to the person who's occupying 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue right now, but more to come. But I'd welcome the Speaker to dispute anything that has been said in the name of us trying to move this country forward consistent with the notions of equal protection under the law and liberty and justice for all. And with that, I yield back to our dynamic anchor, Representative Stacey Plaskett.
Thank you very much, Congressman Jeffries. And I just want to say to you, I really appreciate your remarks. I know that this House has rules and is concerned about decorum in here. We at the Congressional Black Caucus are also very concerned about decorum. And while we uphold the position of the President of the United States, and many individuals, particularly constituents, the underserved within our communities, are fearful about actually us speaking out specifically to the personage and to the person of President Donald Trump. But what we are trying to do in this special order is speak unrefutable facts, not about the personality, not subjective discussion about the president, not our feelings, not our fears, but the actual facts of what has happened in this country and what is happening in this country. Because that is life for our children. That is the very essence of us continuing. That is what democracy is about. And if we cannot critique the actions of our president, then very fearful to us as Americans, very fearful to this House, which is supposed to be a separate branch of government, and which I recall maybe a year ago, it's speaking very vehemently against the person who was in the White House at that time. So at this time, I would yield additional time to the Congresswoman, my classmate from New Jersey, Congresswoman Bonnie Watson-Coleman, and I want to thank you, Congresswoman Watson-Coleman, for your work, particularly in working with other Congressional Black Caucus women to found the Caucus for Black Women and Girls, which is very important right now because this is a forgotten group quite often here in the United States, and you advocating and speaking out for those individuals.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and thank you so much for your leadership and for this hour, this special order hour, and considering the subject matter that we're going to discuss. And I want to talk a little bit about something that's sort of been my observation and my experiences for a very long period of time, and I think that are actually exacerbated by this presidency that we currently have in this House. And let me, by way of association, just comment positively to the remarks of my former my colleague and the former Speaker, Hakeem Jeffries from New York. I've entitled my remarks From the Cradle to the Grave. From the cradle to the grave, Black people in America are required to be resilient, courteous, and persistent. The rules are always different. From the cradle to the grave, Black people in America must be comfortable and confident in ourselves, but only so much that we do not intimidate or aggravate. From the cradle to the grave, Black people in America are told our plight, our struggle, our sacrifice is a mere fantasy in post-racial America, while we witness the reality of institutional racism, conscious discrimination, and our rich history erased or appropriated. From cradle to grave, Black people in America experience this racism and discrimination walking home from the corner store, eating a pack of Skittles, listening to music at a gas station, or simply sitting in our neighborhood park. We experience this racism and discrimination showing up to school in our natural hairstyles, shopping in our favorite stores, or even just showing up to work, including the Senate and the House of Representatives. And last Wednesday, it was reported that Black troops are far more likely than their white counterparts to face court-martial or other forms of military punishment. National data shows us that Black girls are 5.5 times more likely to be suspended from school than white girls. That rate actually balloons in my state of New Jersey to 8.5%. More than 60 years after Brown versus the Board of Education, school systems in the United States are still separate and unequal. As of 2014, California had 31 open desegregation cases. And in 2016, a presidential candidate ran a campaign on divisive rhetoric that targeted our communities, our well-being, and our safe spaces, and it only gets worse. From the cradle to the grave, we're told to calm down, sit down, and be courteous and humble. From the cradle to the grave, the experiences, the challenges, the stories, our history, and even our very being are kept out of boardrooms, classrooms, voting booths, department stores, history books, movie screens, television scripts, and the like. But let me just tell you that from the cradle to the grave, we're built to persevere. We're strengthened to overcome. We are born to lead. We are committed to uplift, and we are fully equipped to soar with weights on our shoulders, even in these times and even under this presidency. And guess what? We do. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those inspiring words, for that motivation to us all. I want to yield at this time some time to the Congressman Dwight Evans of Philadelphia, who comes at us. You know, we always, Congressman Evans, bring up the fact that you're a freshman, but you ain't really a freshman. Everybody acknowledges that. Your leadership and your work in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania and the State House transcends you as a freshman. We call you a super freshman in that respect, because you come with a great deal of experience and wisdom here to the House floor, and I'm very anxious to hear what you have to speak about related to hate crimes and the rise of domestic terrorism against people of color and against minorities here in this country.
I'd like to thank, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the lady from the Virgin Islands for her leadership, along with my colleague from Texas, because both of them have demonstrated real clear leadership for the Congressional Black Caucus under the leadership of our chairman, Richmond. So I want to thank both of them publicly for what they have done, and all of the members in the Congressional Black Caucus. Mr. Speaker, we have a lot to lose under the Trump administration. And it's been very clear, as been stated by all of my colleagues, from health care to food policy to education to affordable housing. The president and his party continue to look for ways to take away we have come to know as fundamental programs behind building stronger neighborhoods. Our nation is facing challenging times, and we simply cannot afford to carry on business as usual. From the nooses found at the Smithsonian National Museum of African History and Culture, to the racial slur spread painted on LeBron James' house during the NBA Finals, and the attack on the Jewish community centers and vandalism in Jewish cemeteries. Our country and our globe are sadly seeking horrific increases in discrimination and racial bias incidents. Dr. King always said, we have come over here in different boats, but we are now in the same boat now. And I really mean just about, think about it. An attack against one of us is an attack against all of us. We know we have come a long way in our fight against racial intolerance, hate in our country, and our journey continues. It doesn't matter if you're Black, Jewish, Hispanic, LGBT, we are stronger together when we celebrate our similarities and than our differences. When we watch the news, it is incredibly upsetting to see what is still happening in 2017. A little over a week ago at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture here in D.C., we found another noose on the Smith grounds, as the museum found director said, it is a painful reminder of the challenges that African Americans continue to face. We know that we are not only seeing violence and intolerance against the African American community, but it is everywhere. This year, at the Mount Carmel Cemetery, a Jewish cemetery just outside of my district in Northeast Philadelphia, countless tombstones were toppled and vandalized. Days after this, the J.C. and Wynwood in my district received a bomb threat. These are just a few of the truly cowardly acts of violence taking place in our neighborhoods. Yet, our Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, and the President claim to be tougher on crime and want to put more people in cities behind bars. This week, Mr. Speaker, I was a keynote speaker at the Gaudenzia House, an addiction treatment and recovery center in my district. The graduates are some of the strongest individuals in our city, and their stories of perseverance and hard work are truly inspiring. I always say, where you start is not where you end up. Throughout my career, I've been dedicated to trying to find ways to build stronger neighborhoods block by block. But to do this, we have to make good jobs, great schools, and access to healthcare reality. We know the tradition and reentry back into our neighbors isn't always easy. In Philadelphia, ShopRite Supermarket is hiring to give good-paying jobs to those who formerly was incarcerated. The company estimated they have given over 500 jobs to incarcerated individuals. This is the result in one city. Sadly, we know that racism and bigotry is still a factor in our community. We have to confront this head on. As the Congressional Black Caucus collectively stands here today, we will not accept what is taking place. We are prepared to face these challenges, and we're asking others to join us because we recognize that we can move this country forward, but it will take all of us. So what we're doing here today is raising the awareness, because we must have this conversation in a public way. We must deal with this issue of racism, non-inclusion, and discrimination. No longer can we accept this. So, Mr. Speaker, I say to you today that as a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, we're prepared to do our part. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Evans. Thank you for your remarks and your continued work to discuss middle communities, middle neighborhoods, and the importance of these communities and how they need to be protected. Congressman Vesey, we've had a discussion here this evening about so much of the racial, the rise in hate crimes, the rise of racial tensions. I know that this weekend, Puerto Rico had its plebiscite in which they talked about becoming a state. And one of the things that I often talk to people about is that the Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, Northern Marianas, Puerto Rico, all of us are territories now after 100 years. And it was never the intent of Congress for areas in the United States to be a territory for 100 years, except for the fact that these are now people of color. These are communities of people of color. And so, based on the insular cases 100 years ago, which said that the people living in the territories and the offshore territories were people of alien races who couldn't understand Anglo-Saxon principles of law, and that's why we're not able to have the full-fledged rights of American citizens. And now we're seeing even here on the mainland, individuals, people of color, who are being treated as second-class citizens, who are not afforded the full protection of this country. When you have incidents like May 20th with Richard Collins, May 26th with Jeremy Joseph Christian, who began shouting racial slurs at two women on a Portland, Oregon train. And as the two men stepped in to de-escalate the situation, those two great men were stabbed to death and a third man was wounded. Congressman Vesey, much needs to be done. We have our moments of silence when there are mass shootings. We mourn for the families of Pulse nightclub and for what has happened in those areas. But it's not enough for us to have special order hours, to have discussions, or even have moments of silence. Action must be taken by this administration.
Absolutely. We do need action taken by this administration. Representative Plaskett. And I mentioned to you earlier, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about the president's history on racism, some of the things that came out during the campaign. It's not anything new, but nevertheless very disturbing. And, you know, why we need for the president, honestly, to lead this discussion. And I'll speak on that a little bit in just a second here. But I did want to stop and take the time to recognize Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson. She has a statement that she wanted to submit into the record, Mr. Speaker, on racism and discrimination in America.
And so we're asking, Mr. Speaker, a unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the subject of this special order hour.
Without objection.
Thank you. Did you have, and I know that there were other issues that you wanted to discuss, Congressman Vesey, with regard to some of these and examples that you wanted to give as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Representative Plaskett. Very briefly, the president's history on racism. From the very beginning of his candidacy, of course, the way he disparaged, Mexicans and Mexican Americans in this country by calling people rapists and accusing people of bringing disease and crime into the United States, pretending that he didn't know who David Duke was. Unbelievable. Pretending to not know who David Duke was.
Well,
Even condone the
I
beating.
think he knows now.
Even condone the beating of a Black Lives Matter protester. But his history extends even before that. Of course, it was very well covered, very well chronicled during the campaign about the Justice Department suing his real estate company and his father's real estate company for not renting apartments to black people, not renting apartments to African American potential tenants. And of course, they ultimately settled that lawsuit because of the wrongdoing that happened there.
Was that in the 1970s, I believe?
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. In 1989, he encouraged and celebrated the wrongful imprisonment of the Central Park Five and took out full-page ads in New York area newspapers calling for the return of the death penalty in response to a very infamous case in which a woman was beaten and raped while jogging in Manhattan Central Park. Donald Trump, back then, before he was president, said that they should be forced to suffer, and when they kill, they should be executed for their crimes. I want these murderers and always will. Of course, there was a lot of public outrage over that case, very well talked about. It was on all the talk shows and what have you. Even after the DNA evidence proved that those men that spent time in prison, that wrongfully spent time in prison, and the DNA evidence exonerated them.
And actually, they weren't men at the time. They were teenagers.
Yeah, that's right.
When
They were teenagers at the time. And even after the DNA evidence exonerated them, still said that maybe they could be guilty of something. And I thought that was just a terrible thing to say. Of course, the New Jersey Casino Control Commission fined Trump Plaza and Hotel $200,000 in 1992 because managers would remove African-American card dealers at the request of certain big-time gamblers that would come in. And in 1996, 20 African-Americans in Indiana sued Trump for failing to honor a promise to hire mostly minority workers for a riverboat casino on Lake Michigan. And let me tell you why, even despite all of this, why the president has the ability to lead a discussion on race. You might remember Shirley Sherrod. I don't know if that name rings a bell with you. She was African-American agriculture worker, worked for U.S. Department of Agriculture, yes. Georgia Department of Agriculture, and was given an example of how she overcame her own bias and her own racism. And of course, her comments were misconstrued and the tapes were made to sound one way. She ultimately lost her job, was offered her job back after it was proven that this conservative website, this conservative newspaper had actually tried to disparage her so they could try to have some sort of a racism equivalence or something, I guess, to try to make their readers feel better. But the reason why I bring that up is because here was a woman that was being honest about and trying to give an example about how she overcame bias and how she overcame prejudice. And the president has an opportunity to talk about Central Park, to talk about racism in his apartments, to talk about the other the issues at the casinos, to talk about the other areas in his life where he's fallen quite short when it comes to fairness and honesty and racism. And so we need him to lead that discussion so we can begin to talk more, and we can begin to heal our country.
Part of leadership is expressing your shortcomings and really using that as an opportunity to move forward and to move the nation forward. So many people look to our president for his leadership and for his thoughts and his out-of-the-box thinking. And this would be a tremendous support, not only to the people who are being oppressed, but to others as well. One of the things I wanted to leave us with was a quote and some work that the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law is working on, who has a mission to secure equal justice for all through rule of law, targeting in particular the inequities confronting African Americans and other racial and ethnic minorities. So in December of 2016, Kristen Clark, who's the president, stated, "Hate crimes and hate-filled incidents stand as a dark cloud over our democracy. The recent spike in hate crimes is attributable in part to the racially charged rhetoric that characterized the 2016 election cycle and the right of the alt-right white nationalist extremism. This is a moment that calls for federal, state, and local officials to use every tool in their arsenal to fully investigate, prosecute these incidents when they occur, and we from the Congressional Black Caucus say to eradicate this from our nation." Thank you so much for this time. And with that, Mr. Speaker, we are closing our CBC Special Order Hour. Again, we would ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 business days to revise and extend their remarks and to put any extraneous matter, relevant matter into the record at this time.
Without objection, the time has expired. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President.